What happens when a simple act of kindness changes everything? When 10 leather-clad strangers knock on your door during the worst storm of the year, do you turn them away or let them in? This is the story of one man who made a choice that would transform his life forever. A choice that proves sometimes the most unexpected people become your greatest protectors. Sometimes kindness creates bonds stronger than blood. And sometimes, when you show mercy to those the world has written off, they show you what loyalty really means. One stormy night, one small diner, one decision that created a brotherhood that would last a lifetime. This isn't just about bikers and business owners. This is about the power of human decency in a world that's forgotten how to trust. If you believe that kindness still matters, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that restore your faith in humanity. And stick around, because what happened next will give you chills and maybe, just maybe, change how you see people forever. The rain was coming down like bullets that October night in 1987. Frank Delacorte had been running his little roadside diner for 15 years, and he'd never seen weather like this. The wind was howling so hard it made the old building shake like a tin can in a tornado, and the power had been flickering on and off for hours like a dying light bulb. Most folks had the good sense to stay home on a night like this, huddled up with their families watching the weather reports on television. But Frank was the kind of man who believed his word was his bond. His hand-painted sign said open until midnight, and by God, he'd stay open until midnight, even if the devil himself came knocking. Frank was 62 years old then, a Vietnam veteran who'd come home to a country that didn't want to hear his stories and didn't want to see his face. He'd taken his army discharge pay, what little there was after Uncle Sam got done with him, and bought this patch of desert land 40 miles outside of Tucson. Built the diner with his own 2 hands, every nail hammered with the kind of precision the military had beaten into his bones, every board placed with the meticulous care of a man who understood that sometimes the difference between life and death was in the details. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a small rectangular building with a neon sign that said, Frank's Place, in faded blue letters that had seen better days and countless desert storms. But inside, it was warm and clean and honest, just like the man who ran it. The floors were always mopped, the counters always wiped down, the coffee always fresh. Frank had learned in the jungle that cleanliness wasn't just about appearance. It was about survival, about maintaining standards when everything else was falling apart. The diner was his fortress against chaos, his proof that a man could build something good with nothing but determination and elbow grease. The diners sat at the crossroads of 2 major highways, the kind of place where long-haul trucks stopped for coffee that could wake the dead and hamburgers that reminded them of their mother's cooking. Frank knew most of his regulars by name, knew how they liked their eggs, knew which ones were going through messy divorces, and which ones had grandkids graduating high school. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who kept a jar of peppermints by the register for the kids who came in with their parents, who never charged full price for coffee to anyone wearing a uniform, whether it was military or police or fire department. His regular customers included Big Jim Morrison, a trucker from Oklahoma who'd been driving the same route for 20 years and always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast and black coffee. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly widow who came in every Tuesday for lunch and always sat in the 3rd booth from the door because it had the best view of the parking lot, where her late husband used to wait for her in his old Buick. There was Tommy Chun, a young construction worker who was saving every penny to bring his wife and kids over from Taiwan, who Frank often slipped an extra piece of pie because he knew the kid was living on nothing but rice and hope. But on this particular night, there wasn't a soul in sight. The storm had started around 6 in the evening, just as the sun was setting over the desert mountains, and it had just kept getting worse with each passing hour. Frank had sent his only employee, Maria Gonzalez, home early. She was a young mother with 2 little ones at home, Sophia, who was 8, and Miguel, who was just starting to walk. And Frank wasn't about to make her drive 20 miles on flooded roads for the sake of a diner that might not see another customer all night. Maria had argued with him, said she needed the money, but Frank had pressed $40 into her hand and told her to consider it a bonus for all the extra hours she'd been working. So he was alone, completely alone, wiping down tables that didn't need wiping, checking the coffee that nobody was drinking, refilling salt shakers that were already full, and listening to the weather radio crackle with increasingly dire warnings about flash floods and dangerous driving conditions. The National Weather Service was telling everyone to stay off the roads unless it was an absolute emergency. The Highway Patrol had closed several sections of interstate due to flooding. Even the most experienced desert drivers were staying home tonight. Frank had been through storms before. Plenty of desert storms could be fierce and sudden, turning dry washes into raging rivers in minutes, splitting the sky with lightning that could be seen for 100 miles. But this one was different. This one felt angry, personal, like nature itself was having a tantrum and taking it out on his little corner of Arizona. The rain wasn't just falling. It was attacking the earth with a vengeance that made Frank think of monsoon seasons in Vietnam, when the sky would open up and dump months of rain in a single afternoon. That's when he heard the rumble. At first, he thought it was thunder, the deep, rolling kind that comes from storms that mean business. But thunder doesn't keep a steady beat like that. Thunder doesn't grow louder and more insistent as it gets closer. Doesn't have that mechanical rhythm that speaks of pistons and cylinders and internal combustion engines pushed to their limits. Frank looked up from the counter where he'd been counting the till for the third time that evening, and his weathered hands stopped moving. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness like sabers. More headlights than any sensible vehicle should have on a night like this. The rumble got louder, deeper, more complex, like a symphony of thunder being conducted by someone who understood the raw power of American engineering. Then Frank could see them clearly through the sheets of rain. Motorcycles. Big ones. Harley-Davidsons, mostly, from the distinctive sound of their engines, but also some other makes he couldn't immediately identify. They pulled into his parking lot like a cavalry charge, their headlights sweeping across the rain-soaked asphalt, their engines roaring even above the howling wind that was now strong enough to bend the palm trees planted along the highway. Frank counted them as they parked under the weak glow of his exterior lights. Big men climbing off even bigger machines, water streaming from their leather jackets and bandanas and long hair that hung in wet ropes around faces that looked like they'd been carved from granite. 10 bikes, 10 riders, all of them moving with the kind of purposeful coordination that spoke of military training, or at least military discipline. They weren't panicked by the storm, weren't rushing for shelter like most people would be. They were calm, methodical, professional. Now, Frank had seen bikers before. Plenty of them. This stretch of highway was popular with motorcycle clubs, especially during the riding season when the weather was good and the roads were clear. Most of them were decent enough folks, just regular people who happened to like motorcycles and leather jackets and the freedom of the open road. Weekend warriors with office jobs and mortgages, middle-aged men having midlife crises, accountants and dentists, and insurance salesmen playing dress-up on the weekends. They'd stop in for coffee and pie, talk about their bikes and their rides, tip well and cause no trouble. But as these 10 men approached his door through the driving rain, Frank could see something fundamentally different about them. The way they moved together, like a unit that had trained and fought together for years. The way they automatically took up defensive positions around the entrance. Not aggressively, but instinctively, like soldiers who'd learned to watch each other's backs in places where that meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. The way they scanned the area with eyes that missed nothing, cataloging exits and entrances and potential threats with the efficiency of men who'd made survival a science. These weren't weekend warriors or middle-aged dentists playing dress. These were the real deal, and Frank had seen enough real deals in his life to recognize the signs, the scars on their knuckles and faces, the tattoos that told stories of places and events most people only saw in movies. The way they carried themselves, confident but not cocky, dangerous but not reckless. They were professionals in a profession most people didn't want to think about. The first man to reach the door was enormous, easily 6'4", and built like a linebacker who'd never stopped training and never stopped fighting. His leather jacket was soaked through, hanging on his massive frame like wet canvas, and Frank could see patches and colors that meant something in a world Frank only knew from movies and news reports and the occasional sensationalized story in the newspaper. The man's face was weathered and scarred, with eyes the color of winter steel that had clearly seen things Frank probably couldn't imagine, and probably wouldn't want to. There was a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of scar that came from something sharp and probably wielded with serious intent to harm. But when he looked at Frank through the glass door, there was something almost apologetic in his expression, something that suggested he was genuinely sorry to be imposing on a stranger during what was clearly a difficult night for everyone involved. His body language wasn't threatening or demanding. If anything, he looked like a man who was used to being turned away, used to doors being slammed in his face, used to being judged by his appearance rather than his intentions. The big man knocked, not pounded like someone demanding entry, but knocked politely, almost gently, like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar or a traveling salesman trying not to wake the baby. The sound was barely audible over the storm, just 3 soft raps of knuckles against glass that somehow managed to convey both urgency and respect. Frank hesitated for exactly 1 second. 1 second where his mind raced through all the possibilities, all the things that could go wrong, all the reasons why a smart man would keep his door locked and his mouth shut. 1 second where he thought about the till behind the counter with its modest collection of small bills and loose change. 1 second where he thought about being alone, completely alone, 40 miles from the nearest police station with no backup and no help coming. 1 second where he thought about all the stories he'd heard on the evening news, about motorcycle gangs and violence and drugs and federal investigations and bodies found in desert graves. 1 second where fear tried to take hold of his good sense and whisper that maybe, just maybe, this was how his story ended. But Frank Delacorte was a man who'd learned some hard lessons about judging people by their appearances. In Vietnam, he'd seen clean-cut college boys, kids who looked like they belonged in church choirs or debate clubs, commit acts of unspeakable cruelty against civilians and prisoners. He'd seen them torture and murder and rape with the casual indifference of men who'd decided that their enemies weren't really human. And he'd also seen men covered in tattoos and scars, men who looked like they'd crawled out of hell itself, carry wounded comrades 4 miles through enemy territory, sharing their lost water and their lost morphine and sometimes their lost breath with brothers who needed it more. He'd learned that the human heart was a mystery that couldn't be solved by looking at the wrapping paper, that courage and cowardice, kindness and cruelty, honor and dishonor could wear any face and speak in any voice. He'd learned that sometimes the people society wrote off as criminals and misfits were the ones who understood loyalty and sacrifice better than anyone in a 3-piece suit ever would. So he walked to the door, his heart pounding but his mind clear, and turned the lock with hands that were steady, despite everything his nervous system was telling him about danger and risk and the wisdom of keeping strangers at bay. He opened it wide enough for all of them to enter if they wanted to, and looked directly into the winter steel eyes of the big man who'd knocked. "Evening," the big man said, his voice surprisingly soft for someone his size, cultured and intelligent in a way that didn't match the stereotypes Frank had seen on television and in movies. "Name's Bear. We're caught in this storm, something fierce, and frankly, it's getting dangerous out there. I know it's late, and I know how we must look to you, but we were hoping we could wait it out inside your establishment. We'll pay for coffee, food, whatever you've got. We're not looking for charity. We just need to get out of this weather before someone gets hurt or worse." Frank looked past Bear at the other 9 men standing behind him in the rain, and what he saw surprised him. They were all soaked to the bone, shivering despite their leather jackets and tough guy reputations, looking miserable and cold and thoroughly human. Some were young, maybe 25 or 30, with the kind of restless energy that spoke of too much testosterone and not enough outlets for it. Others had gray in their beards and lines around their eyes that spoke of decades on the road, of miles and miles of highway under their wheels and stories that would probably curl the hair of decent folks. But all of them, every single one, had that same look as Bear. Tough and intimidating, yes, but also respectful. They weren't demanding entry like entitled customers or threatening violence like movie villains. They were asking, politely and honestly, for shelter from a storm that could kill them if they tried to ride through it. They were vulnerable, and they knew it, and they were hoping that a stranger would show them the kind of mercy that their reputations probably didn't deserve. "Come on in," Frank said, stepping back and opening the door wider. "All of you? Coffee's fresh, and I can fire up the grill if you're hungry." Lord knows he must be after riding in weather like this. The relief on their faces was immediate and genuine, the kind of relief that can't be faked or manufactured. Bear's scarred face broke into a small smile that transformed his entire appearance, making him look less like a movie villain and more like someone's tough but fundamentally decent uncle. "Much obliged, sir," Bear said, his voice carrying a weight of genuine gratitude. "Much obliged. You don't know what this means to us." They filed in one by one, these 10 men who looked like they could tear the place apart without breaking a sweat, like they could reduce Frank's life's work to splinters and ashes in about 5 minutes if they felt like it. Instead, they stood awkwardly by the door, dripping rainwater onto Frank's clean linoleum floor, clearly trying not to track mud and debris through his establishment. They were being careful, considerate, almost deferential in a way that didn't match their appearance or their reputation. It was Bear who finally broke the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the group like a wet blanket. "Where would you like us to sit?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he genuinely wanted to follow Frank's preferences rather than impose his own will on the situation. "We don't want to mess up your place or make you uncomfortable. Just tell us where you'd prefer us, and that's where we'll be." Frank gestured to the largest section of the diner, where he kept several tables pushed together for the occasional bus tours or large family gathering. "Anywhere you're comfortable. And don't worry about the water. These floors have seen worse, believe me. I've had truckers come in here covered in everything from motor oil to desert sand to God knows what else. A little rainwater never hurt anything." As they settled in, pulling out chairs and arranging themselves around the tables with the kind of natural hierarchy that develops in any group of men who've spent serious time together, Frank got his first good look at their patches and colors. Mongols MC. The name was emblazoned across the backs of their leather jackets in letters that looked like they'd been applied by someone who took pride in their work, surrounded by imagery that spoke of loyalty and brotherhood and allegiances that ran deeper than blood. Frank had heard of them. Of course, anyone who'd lived in the Southwest for any length of time and paid any attention to the news had heard stories about the Mongols. They were one of the big ones, one of the outlaw motorcycle clubs that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Rival gangs and federal investigations and violence that seemed to follow them wherever their motorcycles carried them. The FBI considered them a criminal organization. Local police departments had special units dedicated to monitoring their activities. Politicians made careers out of promising to crack down on clubs like the Mongols, but sitting in his diner, dripping rainwater and ordering coffee and asking politely if he minded them smoking in the designated smoking section. They didn't seem like the monsters from the evening news or the villains from biker movies. They seemed like 10 men who'd been caught in a potentially deadly storm and were genuinely grateful for shelter. 10 human beings who were cold and wet and tired and just wanted a warm place to wait out the weather. Bear seemed to be their leader, or at least their spokesman for this particular situation, while the others talked quietly among themselves, sharing stories about close calls with lightning strikes and flooded roads. He approached Frank at the counter with the careful, measured steps of a man who understood that his size and appearance could be intimidating even when he didn't mean them to be. "I want to thank you again for letting us in," Bear said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the other tables, but sincere enough that Frank could hear the genuine emotion behind the words. "Most people see our colors and cross the street. Hell, most business owners see us coming and suddenly remember they're closed for renovations or health department inspections or family emergencies. You didn't even hesitate. You just opened the door and welcomed us in like we were regular customers instead of the kind of people respectable folks warn their kids about." Frank poured him a cup of coffee from the pot he'd been keeping warm all evening, black as midnight and strong enough to wake the dead, the kind of coffee that had kept him going through 15 years of early mornings and late nights. "Man's got to make choices in life," he said, meeting Bear's winter steel eyes directly. "I choose to judge people by how they treat me, not by what they wear or what other people say about them. You knocked politely, you asked respectfully, and you've been nothing but courteous since you walked through my door. That's good enough for me." Bear took a sip of the coffee and nodded approvingly, like a man who understood good coffee when he tasted it. "This is seriously good coffee. You make it yourself." "Every pot, every day, for 15 years. Frank said with the pride of a craftsman discussing his art. Secrets in the grind and the water temperature. Most places rush it, or they use cheap beans, or they let it sit on the burner until it's bitter as medicine. Good coffee is like anything else worth doing. It takes time and attention and caring about the result. Mind if I ask your name? I mean, I can see it's Frank's place from the sign outside, but I'd like to know who we're dealing with here, who we owe this kindness to. Frank de la Corte. This is my place. Built it myself after I got back from Vietnam. Used my discharge pay in about 5 years of 18-hour days to turn a patch of desert into something resembling civilization. Bear's expression changed, becoming more respectful, more understanding. Vietnam. Huh, what? Years. 67 to 69. Did 2 tours because I was young and stupid and thought I had something to prove. Learned better eventually. Well, Frank de la Corte, you're a good man. A better man than most. World needs more like you, especially these days when everybody's so quick to judge and so slow to show mercy. Over the next hour, as the storm continued to rage outside with a fury that showed no signs of diminishing, something remarkable began to happen. The Mongols, these hard men, with their leather and patches and reputation for violence, began to transform before Frank's eyes. They became just people, regular people with jobs and families and hopes and fears and stories that had nothing to do with crime or violence or federal investigations. They talked about their motorcycles with the passion that other men reserved for sports teams or vintage cars. They discussed the technical aspects of engines and transmissions and suspension systems with the expertise of master mechanics. They shared stories about epic rides across the country, about camping under stars in places most people would never see, about the freedom and camaraderie that came from traveling the highways of America with nothing but your bike and your brothers for company. Some of them were mechanics, working in legitimate shops, and earning honest livings, fixing cars and trucks and motorcycles for regular customers. Others were construction workers, building the houses and office buildings and shopping centers that kept America growing. One was a Navy veteran who'd served on destroyers in the Pacific, and he and Frank spent 20 minutes comparing stories about military food and military discipline and the strange bonds that form between men who've served their country in faraway places. The youngest of the group, a kid they called Rabbit, couldn't have been more than 25 years old. He had the kind of fresh face that suggested he was relatively new to this life, still learning the codes and customs and unwritten rules that governed the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. He was shy at first, deferential to the older members, speaking only when spoken to and always showing proper respect to Bear and the other veterans. But when Frank brought out a plate of homemade apple pie, the same recipe his mother had used back in Ohio before the war, changed everything. Rabbit's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. He took one bite and actually moaned with pleasure, the kind of sound that comes from tasting something that connects you to memories you thought you'd lost. "My grandmother used to make pie like this," Rabbit said, his voice thick with emotion and nostalgia, "back in Missouri, before she passed. Haven't had anything this good since she died 3 years ago. This tastes exactly like hers." Exactly. Frank felt something warm and familiar spreading through his chest, the same feeling he got when one of his regular customers complimented Maria's cooking, or when a trucker told him that Frank's coffee had kept him awake and alert for the last 200 miles of dangerous driving. It was the feeling of purpose, of providing something people genuinely needed, whether that was food or warmth or just a safe place to rest and remember better times. As the night wore on and the storm showed no signs of letting up, the Mongols began to tell Frank about their club in ways that had nothing to do with the sensationalized stories that appeared in newspapers and on television news programs. Not the violent, criminal organization that law enforcement agencies described in their press conferences, but the real story of what it meant to be a Mongol. They talked about brotherhood, about codes of honor that were older than the Constitution and more binding than any legal contract. They talked about loyalty that ran deeper than blood, about men who would literally die for each other without question or hesitation. They talked about taking care of each other's families when someone was locked up or killed, about making sure that widows and children never went without food or shelter or protection. They told Frank about their charity work, the side of their organization that never made the news because it didn't fit the narrative, that sold newspapers and television advertising. How they organized toy drives for underprivileged children every Christmas, delivering thousands of presents to kids whose parents couldn't afford to make the holiday special. How they spent weekends helping elderly club members and their families with home repairs and yard work and anything else that needed doing. How they'd spent the previous month rebuilding a house for a family whose father had been killed in a construction accident, working 16-hour days in the desert heat without asking for anything in return except the knowledge that they'd helped people who needed help. People see the patches and the motorcycles and they think they know who we are, Bear explained during one of their conversations. They think we're all criminals and drug dealers and murderers. And yeah, there are some clubs that fit that description. There are some people wearing patches who deserve everything law enforcement throws at them. But most of us, we're just men who found something in this brotherhood that we couldn't find anywhere else. We found loyalty. We found purpose. We found a code to live by that means something. Frank found himself opening up in return, something he rarely did with customers. He told them about Vietnam, about being 19 years old and scared out of his mind, about watching friends die in ways that still gave him nightmares 30 years later. He told them about coming home to protests and hatred and spitting, and a country that seemed to blame him personally for an unpopular war that he'd had no choice but to fight. He told them about the long, dark years after the war when he'd tried to drink away the memories and the guilt and the rage that seemed to live in his bones like a chronic disease, about the job applications that were quietly discarded when potential employers learned about his military service, about the relationships that ended when women decided they didn't want to deal with a man who woke up screaming some nights, about the slow process of rebuilding his life, one day at a time. He told them about buying this land with his discharge pay, about the dream of creating something honest and good in a world that often seemed neither, about learning construction and plumbing and electrical work from library books and trial and error, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands that would outlast him and maybe provide comfort to travelers for generations to come. "You know what I respect about you, Frank?" Bear said as the storm finally began to show signs of weakening around the wind dying down from a howl to a steady moan and the rain changing from a torrent to merely heavy. "You didn't just let us in. You treated us like human beings. You listened to our stories and shared your own. You fed us and gave us warmth and showed us the kind of basic human decency that's become rarer than gold in this country. Do you know how unusual that is for people like us?" Frank refilled Bear's coffee cup for what must have been the 4th or 5th time that night, noting that the big man had impeccable manners when it came to saying please and thank you. People like you, people who look like trouble. People who wear patches that make police officers nervous and cause mothers to pull their children closer when we walk by. People who society has decided are beyond redemption, not worth the effort of understanding or helping or even acknowledging as human. We're used to being judged by our appearance rather than our actions, used to being written off before we've had a chance to show who we really are. "I've found that trouble usually announces itself pretty clearly," Frank said, thinking about his experiences in Vietnam and the years since. "Truly dangerous people don't usually knock politely and ask if they can come in. They don't say please and thank you. They don't worry about tracking mud on your floors or making you uncomfortable. You fellas have been nothing but respectful since you walked through my door. You've paid for everything you've ordered. You've been polite to me and to each other. And you've shown more consideration for my property than some of my regular customers do. That's good enough for me." By midnight, the storm had finally passed completely, leaving behind the clean, fresh smell that always follows desert rains and the sound of water dripping from the eaves and running in the gutters that would carry the excess away to dry washes that would bloom with wildflowers in a few weeks. The Mongols gathered their gear and prepared to leave, but not before each of them approached Frank personally to shake his hand and thank him for his kindness. They were different now than they had been when they'd first walked through his door. Still tough, still dangerous looking, still wearing the patches and colors that marked them as members of one of America's most notorious motorcycle clubs. But they were also more human, somehow, more individual, more real than the stereotypes and caricatures that Frank had carried in his mind, based on news reports and movie portrayals. Rabbit was the second to last to leave, and he pressed a $20 bill into Frank's hand, despite Frank's protests. "For the pie," the young man said, "and for treating me like I mattered. You reminded me of my grandmother tonight, and that's worth more than money can buy." Bear was the last to go, as befit his apparent leadership role in the group. He stood by the door for a moment, looking around the diner like he was memorizing every detail, every table and chair and coffee cup and piece of pie. "Frank," he said finally, "I want you to know something, and I want you to understand that I'm dead serious about this. You showed us kindness tonight when you didn't have to. You opened your door when most people would have kept it locked. You treated us with respect when most people treat us like criminals or animals. That means something to us. It means everything." "It was nothing," Frank said, genuinely believing it. "Just common decency. Basic human courtesy. The way people ought to treat each other." "No," Bear said, his voice carrying an intensity that made Frank pay attention. "It was everything. It was the difference between being caught in a potentially deadly storm and finding shelter. It was the difference between being treated like monsters and being treated like human beings. And because of that, because of what you did tonight, you're under our protection now, whether you understand what that means or not." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper with a phone number written on it in careful block letters. "I'm going to leave you this number. You probably won't ever need to use it, and I hope to God you never do. But if you ever find yourself in trouble, any kind of trouble at all, you call this number. Day or night, rain or shine, it doesn't matter. You call, and we'll come. Not just me, but all of us. The entire club, if necessary. We take care of our own. And as of tonight, you're one of our own." Frank took the paper, not really understanding what Bear meant, but recognizing the sincerity in the big man's voice. "I appreciate that, Bear. I really do. But I can't imagine what kind of trouble an old man running a diner could get into that would require help from your organization." Bear's smile was grim, knowing, the expression of a man who'd seen enough of the world to understand that trouble could find anyone, anywhere, anytime. "Trust me, Frank. In this business, in this world, trouble has a way of finding good people. And when it does, when someone tries to take advantage of your decency or hurt you because they think you're weak or alone, they're going to discover that you're neither weak nor alone. They're going to discover that you have friends who take loyalty very, very seriously." The 10 Mongols roared out of Frank's parking lot and into the desert night, their taillights disappearing into the darkness like red stars fading at dawn. Frank stood in his doorway for a long time after they were gone, listening to the sound of their engines, growing fainter and fainter until all that remained was the drip of water from the eaves and the distant rumble of thunder from a storm that was already 50 miles away. He went back inside and began cleaning up, washing coffee cups and wiping down tables, and generally restoring his diner to the pristine condition he maintained as a matter of professional pride. As he worked, he thought about the evening that had just passed, about the choice he'd made when those 10 strangers had knocked on his door during the worst storm he'd seen in years. He thought about Bear's words, about protection and loyalty and friendship, concepts that seemed almost old-fashioned in a world that was becoming increasingly impersonal and transactional. He thought about Rabbit and his grandmother's apple pie, about the way the young man's face had lit up at the taste of something that connected him to better memories. He thought about the stories they'd shared, the humanity they'd revealed beneath the leather and patches and intimidating appearances. Most of all, he thought about the lesson he'd learned that night, or rather, the lesson he'd had confirmed, that people were more complex than their reputations, more human than their images, more worthy of compassion than society often allowed them to be, that sometimes the most dangerous-looking people were capable of the greatest gratitude, the deepest loyalty, the most profound appreciation for simple acts of human kindness. Frank folded the piece of paper with Bear's phone number and put it in his wallet, not because he expected to ever use it, but because it represented something important. It represented the possibility that in a world full of strangers and suspicion and fear, genuine connections could still be made between people who had no reason to trust each other except the evidence of their own experience. 3 months later, Frank understood exactly what Bear had meant about protection and trouble finding good people. It started on a Tuesday morning in January, one of those crystal-clear desert winter days when the air was so clean and sharp it almost hurt to breathe. Frank was in his usual routine, prepping for the breakfast rush that would begin when the truckers started rolling at dawn, when two men in expensive suits walked into his diner. They weren't customers. That much was obvious from the way they looked around the place, like they were conducting an inspection rather than seeking a meal. They were both in their 40s, well-groomed and professionally dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from having money and power and the assumption that both can solve any problem that might arise. They ordered coffee, but didn't drink it, just sat in the corner booth, making notes on legal pads and whispering to each other in the kind of hushed tones that people use when they're discussing things they don't want overheard. Frank had seen their type before, usually in the context of business deals gone wrong or legal disputes that ended up in small claims court. They were the kind of men who measured everything in terms of profit and loss, who saw small businesses like his as either opportunities to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. They made him nervous in a way that the Mongols never had, because their weapons were lawsuits and permits and bureaucratic harassment rather than fists and motorcycles and straightforward intimidation. The next day, they were back. This time with a third man who carried himself like someone accustomed to getting his way without having to ask twice. This one was older, maybe 55 or 60, with silver hair and cold eyes, and the kind of expensive watch that cost more than Frank made in a good month. He wore his authority like other men wore cologne, liberally and with the assumption that everyone around him would notice and be impressed. On the third day, the man in charge approached Frank directly, not bothering with the pretense of being a customer or showing any interest in the social niceties that normally governed interactions between strangers. "Mr. Delacorte," he said, his voice carrying the kind of flat authority that brooked no argument. "My name is Richard Hawthorne. I represent Southwestern Development Corporation. We've been observing your establishment for the past few days, and we have a business proposition for you that I think you'll find very interesting." Frank continued wiping down the counter, not looking up from his work. He'd learned in Vietnam that showing weakness or intimidation to bullies only made them push harder. "I'm listening," he said in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather or the price of coffee beans. "We're building a truck stop complex just 5 miles up the highway," Hawthorne continued, his voice taking on the practiced rhythm of a man who'd made this speech before. "Full-service facility, gas station with 24 pumps, convenience store with everything a traveler could need, restaurant with seating for 200 people, shower facilities, laundry, even a small motel. It's going to be the most modern, comprehensive facility between Phoenix and El Paso. It's going to put every small, outdated operation like this one out of business within 6 months of opening." Frank looked up then, meeting Hawthorne's cold eyes directly. "And you're telling me this because we're prepared to make you an offer for your land. A generous offer, more generous than you'd get from anyone else, and certainly more than this place will be worth once our facility opens and starts drawing away all your customers." Frank set down his cleaning rag and gave Hawthorne his full attention. "And if I'm not interested in selling—" Hawthorne's smile was as cold as January wind in the desert, all teeth and no warmth. "Well, Mr. Delacorte, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. You see, we've already purchased most of the surrounding land. We control the water rights now, which means we control access to the aquifer that supplies your well. And we have extensive connections with the county health department, the building inspector, the zoning commission, the fire marshal. Amazing how many code violations a determined inspector can find in an old building like this one. Amazing how many permits can be mysteriously delayed or denied. Amazing how difficult it can become to operate a business when the bureaucracy decides to take a very, very close look at your operations. The threat was as clear as the Arizona sky and just as vast. Sell out voluntarily, or be driven out of business through harassment, legal manipulation, and bureaucratic warfare. Frank had heard stories like this before. Small business owners pushed around by developers with deep pockets and political connections. Most of them eventually gave up, took whatever money was offered, and walked away from their life's work rather than fight a battle they couldn't win. But Frank Delacorte hadn't survived 2 tours in Vietnam, 15 years in the restaurant business, and countless encounters with bullies, both foreign and domestic, by backing down from threats. "I'm not interested in selling," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of finality that comes from absolute certainty. Hawthorne's smile faded like morning mist in desert heat. "I'd strongly advise you to reconsider, Mr. Delacorte. We can make your life very, very difficult. More difficult than you can imagine." "My life's been difficult before," Frank replied, thinking of rice paddies and mortar shells and coming home to a country that blamed him for things beyond his control. "I'm still here." Hawthorne stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether Frank was bluffing or genuinely prepared to fight. Whatever he saw in Frank's weathered face and steady eyes must have convinced him that this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd expected. "You have 48 hours to reconsider," Hawthorne said finally. "After that, we'll assume you've made your choice and act accordingly." That afternoon, after Hawthorne and his associates had left in their expensive sedan, Frank sat in his empty diner and thought about what came next. He'd seen this kind of pressure campaign before, both in the military and in civilian life. First would come the inspections. Dozens of Tim, each one designed to find violations that could be used to justify fines and citations and ultimately closure. Then would come the permit challenges, the license reviews, the 100 different ways that bureaucrats could strangle a small business in red tape and legal expenses. They would challenge his food service license, claiming violations of health codes that had never been enforced before. They would question his building permits, demanding structural inspections and upgrades that would cost tens of thousands of dollars he didn't have. They would find problems with his electrical systems, his plumbing, his ventilation, his parking lot, his signage, his waste disposal, anything and everything that could be used as a weapon against him. And all the while, they would be building their massive truck stop complex 5 miles up the highway, drawing away his customers with lower prices, better facilities, and the kind of modern conveniences that his little diner could never compete with. Even if he managed to survive the bureaucratic assault, even if he found the money to pay the fines and make the required improvements, he would still face the economic reality of competing against a corporation with unlimited resources and political connections. It was a death sentence, delivered with a smile and dressed up as a business opportunity. Frank was still thinking about his options when Maria arrived for her evening shift. She took one look at his face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Frank, ¿qué pasa? You look like someone just told you the world was ending." Frank explained about Hawthorne and the Development Corporation, about the threats disguised as business offers, and the bureaucratic war that was about to begin. Maria listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing angrier with each detail, her hands clenching into fists as she understood what was being done to the man who'd given her a job when no one else would, who'd advanced her money when her kids were sick, who'd become like a father to her over the past 3 years. "Doce hijos de puta," she said when he finished, the curse slipping out in Spanish before she caught herself. "Excuse my language, Frank, but that's what they are. Sons of bitches who think they can just push people around because they have money and connections. They come in here with their suits and their lawyers and think they can just take whatever they want from whoever they want." "Language is fine," Frank said with a tired smile, "but I don't know what to do about it. They've got teams of lawyers and political connections going back decades. I've got a 15-year-old diner and a bank account that barely covers the monthly expenses. This isn't exactly a fair fight." That's when Maria surprised him by walking over to the cash register and pulling something out of her purse. It was a business card, slightly worn around the edges, with a phone number written on it in block letters. "Frank, do you remember those bikers who came in during that big storm a few months ago? The ones with all the pachias and motorcycles?" Frank nodded slowly. "The Mongols? What about them?" "One of them, the big one, the leader, he gave you his phone number. Said if you ever needed anything at all, to call. He said you were under their protection now." Frank stared at the card, suddenly remembering Bear's words about trouble finding good people and the need for friends who took loyalty seriously. At the time, it had seemed like an abstract concept, the kind of thing that sounded impressive but would never actually matter in the real world. Now, facing the prospect of losing everything he'd worked for, to a corporation that saw his life's work as nothing more than an inconvenience to be bulldozed, it seemed like maybe Bear had understood something about the world that Frank was only now beginning to grasp. "You think I should call a motorcycle gang about a business dispute with developers?" Frank asked, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't really a question. "I think you should call friends who offered to help," Maria replied firmly. "And Frank, those men weren't just customers that night. They respected you. They saw something good in this place. Something worth protecting. You treated them like human beings when the rest of the world treats them like criminals. Maybe it's time to see if they meant what they said about loyalty and protection. What if they can't help? What if this is the kind of problem that can't be solved with motorcycles and leather jackets?" Maria's smile was fierce, full of the kind of certainty that comes from understanding people at a fundamental level. "Frank, you didn't see the way they looked at you that night. You didn't hear the way they talked about honor and brotherhood and taking care of people who showed them kindness. These aren't weekend warriors playing These are men who live by codes that most people have forgotten. And one of those codes is that you protect your own, no matter what." That night, after the diner closed and Maria had gone home to her children, Frank sat in his office staring at Bear's phone number. It seemed crazy, calling an outlaw motorcycle club for help with corporate developers and bureaucratic harassment. What could bikers possibly do about lawyers and building inspectors and county commissioners? How could leather jackets and Harley-Davidsons compete with political connections and unlimited legal budgets? But then he thought about the alternatives. He could fight alone, spending money he didn't have on lawyers who probably couldn't match Southwestern Development's legal team anyway. He could give up, sell out for whatever Hawthorne was willing to pay, and watch 15 years of work disappear into someone else's profit margin. Or he could trust in the friendship of 10 men who'd shared coffee and stories with him during the worst storm in years. Men who'd looked him in the eye and promised that he would never stand alone again. When he really thought about it, it wasn't much of a choice at all. Frank dialed the number. Bear answered on the second ring, his voice immediately recognizable, despite the months that had passed since that stormy night. "Yeah, Bear, this is Frank Delacorte. From the diner? You and your friends stopped by during that storm back in October." Frank Bear's voice immediately warmed with genuine pleasure and something that might have been relief. "Good to hear from you, brother. How's business? How's life treating you?" "Well, that's actually why I'm calling. I've got a problem, and I remember you said if I ever needed anything." "Talk to me," Bear said, his tone immediately becoming serious and focused. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it." Frank explained the situation with Hawthorne and Southwestern Development Corporation, laying out the threats and the timeline and the impossible choice he was facing. Bear listened without interruption, but Frank could hear something changing in the big man's voice as the story unfolded, a hardening that suggested he was taking this very personally. "Corporate vultures," Bear said, when Frank finished, his voice carrying a cold anger that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "They think money and political connections make them untouchable. They think they can push around decent people just because they wear suits instead of patches, because they have law degrees instead of oil under their fingernails. They're about to learn how wrong they are. Bear, I don't want any trouble. I don't want anyone getting hurt or arrested or anything like that. I just want to keep my diner. Keep serving coffee to truckers and families and anyone else who needs a good meal and a friendly face." "Frank, listen to me carefully," Bear said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "You're not asking for trouble. Trouble came looking for you. These corporate parasites decided to target you because they thought you were alone, thought you were weak, thought you had nobody to stand with you against their lawyers and their bureaucrats and their dirty money. They were wrong. Yo, Abbas, you have the entire Mongols motorcycle club, every chapter, every member, every brother who's ever worn the patch. And when someone threatens our family, they find out what real power looks like. What does that mean? Exactly. What are you going to do? It means you go about your business like normal. Serve your coffee, cook your food, treat your customers right, just like you always have. And let us worry about Mr. Hawthorne and his corporate friends. They want to play hardball? Fine. But they're about to discover that they're not the only ones who know how to apply pressure. I don't understand. How can you fight lawyers and building inspectors and county commissioners? Bear's laugh was low and dangerous, full of knowledge that Frank couldn't even imagine. Frank, you'd be amazed at how many building inspectors and county commissioners and even lawyers get nervous when 50 Harleys pull up outside their offices. You'd be amazed at how many bureaucrats suddenly remember that they have other priorities when they realize that their decisions affect people who have friends. Lots of friends. Friends who know where they live and where their kids go to school and where they eat lunch every day. You're not talking about violence, are you? Because I won't be part of anything that hurts innocent people. Violence? Bear sounded genuinely surprised. Frank, we're not thugs. We don't hurt innocent people. We don't even hurt guilty people unless they hurt us first. But we also don't let corporate bullies destroy good people just because they can afford better lawyers. What we're talking about is community pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, letting these people know that their actions have consequences, that there are people watching, people who care about what happens to you and your diner. I still don't understand how that works. It works because power isn't just about money and political connections. Real power comes from people, from communities, from networks of relationships that can't be bought or sold or threatened into submission. These corporate types, they're used to dealing with isolated individuals who can't fight back. They're not used to dealing with organized groups who know how to apply pressure in ways that money can't fix. 3 days later, Frank was working the morning shift, trying to maintain his normal routine despite the anxiety that had settled in his stomach like a lead weight. When he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles, he looked out the window and felt his jaw drop in amazement. It wasn't just the 10 Mongols who had taken shelter during the storm. It was at least 50 of them, maybe more, their chrome gleaming in the desert sun like an army of chrome and steel angels. They filled his parking lot completely and spilled out onto the highway shoulder, their engines creating a symphony of controlled thunder that could probably be heard for miles. Bear was among them, along with several faces Frank recognized from that stormy night months ago. But there were many new faces too. Hard men and a few equally hard women, all wearing the distinctive patches of the Mongols MC. Some were older, gray-bearded veterans with scars and stories written in the lines around their eyes. Others were younger, but all of them carried themselves with the same combination of confidence and controlled danger that Frank had noticed in the original group. They dismounted their bikes in perfect formation, like a military unit that had practiced this maneuver countless times, and began walking toward the diner with a kind of purposeful stride that suggested they had serious business to attend to. But when Bear reached the door, he knocked politely, just as he had on that stormy night, and waited for Frank to invite them in. "Morning," Frank Bear said with a grin that was equal parts friendship and predatory satisfaction. "Hope you don't mind, but we brought some friends along for breakfast. We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by, show our support for local business. You know how it is." The next 2 hours were organized chaos of the most beautiful kind Frank had ever witnessed. 50-plus Mongols filled his diner to capacity and beyond, ordering coffee and eggs and pancakes and everything else on the menu with the enthusiasm of men who'd ridden long and hard and worked up serious appetites. Frank and Maria worked frantically to keep up with the orders, but they were both smiling so hard their faces hurt. The bikers were polite, patient when the food took longer than usual, and they tipped like millionaires celebrating a lottery win. More importantly, word spread through the local community faster than wildfire in August. By 10 in the morning, everyone within 50 miles knew that Frank's place was under the protection of the Mongols MC. Truckers called ahead on their CB radios to make sure it was safe to stop. Local residents drove by slowly, trying to get a glimpse of the legendary outlaw bikers they'd only heard about in news reports. Even the county sheriff showed up, not to cause trouble but to assess the situation and make sure everything was peaceful. And everything was peaceful. The Mongols conducted themselves like perfect gentlemen, engaging in friendly conversations with other customers, helping Maria carry trays when the orders got too heavy, even organizing an impromptu collection to help pay for coffee for a family that was obviously struggling financially. They were living proof that reputation and reality don't always match, that people who look dangerous can be capable of extraordinary kindness and consideration. The news reached Richard Hawthorne before lunch. The developer showed up at exactly 2 in the afternoon, driving his expensive sedan, and wearing his expensive suit, and carrying his expensive briefcase full of legal documents and threats. But his confidence seemed to evaporate when he saw the parking lot full of motorcycles and realized that his carefully planned intimidation campaign had run into an unexpected obstacle. He approached the counter where Frank was refilling napkin dispensers, trying to maintain his usual routine despite the circus atmosphere that had taken over his diner. "Mr. Delacorte," Hawthorne said, his voice not quite as confident as it had been during his previous visits, "I see you have ... visitors today." "Friends," Frank corrected, emphasizing the word. "They're friends, good friends, who heard I might be having some business difficulties and decided to show their support." Bear appeared beside Hawthorne as if he'd materialized from thin air, his massive presence somehow making the developer shrink despite his expensive clothes and professional credentials. Up close, Bear was even more intimidating than the news reports had suggested, but his smile was polite and his voice was conversational. "You must be the development fellow Frank told us about," Bear said pleasantly, extending a hand that was scarred and calloused and probably capable of crushing walnuts. "Richard Hawthorne." "Right, from Southwestern Development Corporation. I've heard a lot about you and your company's business practices." Hawthorne shook the offered hand reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the physical contact, but not wanting to appear weak in front of 50 bikers who were watching his every move. "I understand you've been pressuring our friend Frank here to sell his business," Bear continued, his tone remaining conversational, but his eyes growing cold as winter steel. "Making threats about inspections and permits and bureaucratic harassment. Trying to force him out so you can build your own facility down the road." "I was simply making him a legitimate business offer," Hawthorne said stiffly, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the obvious nervousness in his voice. "There's nothing illegal about competitive business practices." "Oh, I'm sure it's all perfectly legal," Bear replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You corporate types are very good at staying just barely on the right side of the law, while you destroy people's lives and communities. Very good at using the system against people who can't fight back. But here's the thing, Mr. Hawthorne. Frank isn't alone. He has friends now. Lots of friends. Friends who don't much care for bullies, no matter how expensive their suits are." Hawthorne looked around the diner at the assembled Mongols, who had stopped their conversations and were now focused intently on the exchange taking place at the counter. 50 pairs of eyes, cold and calculating, and completely unimpressed by his money, or his connections, or his legal threats. Men who looked like they'd fought every war since Vietnam, and won most of them. Men who clearly took loyalty very, very seriously. "This is intimidation," Hawthorne said, his voice rising slightly as he tried to regain some measure of control over the situation. "You can't threaten me into abandoning a legitimate business development project." "Threaten you?" Bear looked genuinely confused, even hurt by the suggestion. "Who's threatening anybody? We're just having breakfast. Frank makes the best coffee between here and Phoenix, and word gets around about places like this. Isn't that right, brothers?" A chorus of agreement rose from around the diner, men's voices calling out testimonials to Frank's coffee and Maria's cooking, and the general excellence of the establishment they'd come to support. "Outstanding coffee. Best pancakes I've had in 20 years. This place is a treasure, a real piece of Americana. Frank's the kind of man who makes this country great." Bear turned back to Hawthorne, his expression innocent as a chore boy's. "See? We're just satisfied customers who think Frank should keep doing exactly what he's doing for as long as he wants to do it. Forever. If that's his choice." Hawthorne was rapidly doing calculations in his head, weighing his options and coming up short on every front. Corporate lawyers and political connections were powerful weapons, but they were useless against 50 armed men who looked like they'd learned conflict resolution in places where the Geneva Convention was just a suggestion. Bureaucratic harassment was an effective tool against isolated individuals, but it became much more complicated when those individuals had friends who knew how to apply counterpressure in ways that money couldn't fix. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," Hawthorne said finally, his professional composure cracking around the edges. "Perhaps we've been too aggressive in our approach to this project." "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all," Bear replied smoothly. "I think we understand each other perfectly. You were trying to force Frank to sell his business through intimidation and bureaucratic harassment. Now, you're not going to do that anymore. Right. Hawthorne nodded quickly, probably more quickly than his dignity preferred. Right. Absolutely. Mr. Delacorte is free to operate his establishment for as long as he chooses. We have no intention of interfering with his business in any way. Wonderful, Bear said, clapping Hawthorne on the shoulder with enough force to make the smaller man stagger slightly. I'm so glad we could clear that up. Frank, would you mind getting Mr. Hawthorne a cup of coffee for the road? On the house? Of course. Frank poured coffee into a disposable cup, adding cream and sugar because Hawthorne's hands were shaking too badly to do it himself. The developer accepted the coffee with obvious reluctance, probably afraid that drinking it would somehow bind him to some kind of agreement he didn't understand. As Hawthorne backed toward the door, his two associates trailing behind him like well-dressed sheep, Bear called out one final time. Oh, Mr. Hawthorne, one more thing you should probably know. If any building inspectors or health department officials or permit officers show up here giving Frank trouble, we're going to assume they're working on your behalf, and that would make us very unhappy. You really wouldn't want to make us unhappy, would you? Hawthorne shook his head vigorously and practically ran to his car, his associates scrambling to keep up. They drove away fast enough to leave rubber on Frank's parking lot, and, according to local gossip, Southwestern Development Corporation quietly abandoned their truck stop project within the week and moved their operations to a different county entirely. Over the following months, something remarkable happened to Frank's place. It didn't just recover from the threat posed by corporate developers. It transformed into something entirely new and extraordinary. The Mongols didn't just visit occasionally as customers. They adopted the diner as an unofficial clubhouse, a neutral ground where different chapters could meet safely, a place where old-timers could tell stories to young prospects, and where the real culture of the club could be passed down from generation to generation. Frank found himself in the unique and somewhat surreal position of being the civilian friend and confidant of one of America's most notorious motorcycle clubs. He learned their real history, not the sensationalized version that appeared in newspaper headlines and federal law enforcement press releases, but the actual story of men who'd found brotherhood and purpose in an organization that demanded loyalty, honor, and sacrifice from its members. He learned about their code of conduct, their rules about respecting civilians and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He learned about their charity work, the side of their organization that never made the news because it didn't fit the narrative that sold. Newspapers and television advertising time. Every Christmas, they organized massive toy drives for underprivileged children. Every Thanksgiving, they served meals to homeless veterans and families who couldn't afford holiday dinners. When natural disasters struck, they were often among the first to arrive with supplies and manpower for relief efforts. Most importantly, Frank learned that his simple act of kindness during that stormy October night had created bonds that were stronger than blood, more enduring than legal contracts, more reliable than any insurance policy ever written. The Mongols considered him family now, and they protected their family with everything they had. Business at Frank's place didn't just improve, it exploded. Bikers from all over the Southwest, and eventually from all over the country, made pilgrimages to the little diner that had shown kindness to the Mongols and earned their eternal loyalty. But it wasn't just bikers. Word spread among truckers and travelers and anyone else who spent time on the highways that this was a special place, a place where people were judged by their character rather than their appearance, where anyone could find a good meal and a friendly welcome, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Frank hired more staff to handle the increased volume. He expanded the menu to include more variety and larger portions. He added a small gift shop that sold Mongols MC merchandise, with all proceeds going to local charities that supported veterans and underprivileged children. He installed additional parking and upgraded his kitchen equipment to handle the constant stream of customers who came not just for the food, but for the atmosphere of acceptance and genuine human warmth that couldn't be replicated by corporate chains. The diner that had barely scraped by for 15 years suddenly became one of the most successful restaurants in southern Arizona. But success hadn't changed Frank's fundamental approach to business or his treatment of customers. He still knew most of his regulars by name. He still kept peppermints by the register for children. He still served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and maintain standards of cleanliness and quality that would have made his drill sergeants proud. But more than the financial success, more than the regional fame, Frank treasured the friendships he had developed with men who had initially seemed like the most unlikely companions imaginable. Bear became like a brother to him, stopping by at least once a week just to talk about life, motorcycles, business, and the state of the world. Other Mongols became regular fixtures at the diner, men with names like Diesel and Wrench and Iron Mike, tough guys with hearts of gold, who treated Frank like a beloved uncle, and Maria like a sister worthy of protection. The young one, Rabbit, developed an especially close relationship with Frank. The kid reminded Frank of himself at that age, trying to find his place in a world that seemed designed to chew up and spit out young men who didn't fit conventional molds. Frank became a mentor to Rabbit, teaching him about business principles, about treating all people with respect, regardless of their station in life, about the crucial difference between being tough and being cruel, about the importance of keeping your word and standing by your friends. Years passed. The diner continued to prosper. Frank aged gracefully, his hair going completely white, but his spirit remaining strong and his commitment to hospitality unwavering. The Mongols protected him from developers, from competitors who tried to undercut his prices or steal his customers, from anyone who thought they could take advantage of an aging man running a roadside diner. But more importantly, they protected his faith in humanity. Every time Frank saw a customer hesitate at the door because of the motorcycles in the parking lot, every time he watched someone's preconceptions and prejudices melt away as they experienced the genuine kindness and respect that the Mongols showed to everyone who entered their adopted home, he was reminded that people were infinitely more complex than their appearances suggested, more capable of growth and change than society generally believed. On the 10th anniversary of that stormy night that had changed everything, the Mongols organized a celebration that became legendary throughout the Southwest and beyond. Hundreds of bikers came from all over the country, not just Mongols, but members of other clubs who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects to the diner owner who had demonstrated what real brotherhood looked like. They came from as far away as New York and Florida and Washington State, men and women who had never met Frank, but who understood the significance of what had happened at his diner. The celebration lasted 3 days and drew visitors from all walks of life. Local news crews came to document the event. Food critics from major newspapers wrote articles about the unique atmosphere and genuinely excellent cuisine. Sociologists and anthropologists studied the interactions between outlaw bikers and mainstream society. Even law enforcement officials, initially suspicious of such a large gathering of motorcycle club members, eventually acknowledged that it was one of the most peaceful and well-organized events they had ever supervised. Frank stood behind his counter on the final night of the celebration, looking out at a parking lot that contained more motorcycles than most people would see in several lifetimes, listening to the sound of laughter and conversation and live music from men and women whose society had written off as criminals and outcasts. And he thought about that crucial moment 10 years earlier when he had faced a choice between opening his door and keeping it locked, between showing trust and giving in to fear, between treating strangers as potential threats and welcoming them as potential friends. 1 second, one choice, one simple act of human kindness that had rippled out into the world in ways he could never have imagined, creating connections and friendships and loyalties that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless other people who had been touched by the story. Bear found him there, standing behind the counter with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face that spoke of deep contentment and gratitude. "You okay, brother?" Bear asked, his voice gentle with concern and affection. "More than okay," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I was just thinking about that night, 10 years ago, about the choice I made when you knocked on my door. If I had decided differently, if I had kept that door locked, ... But you didn't," Bear interrupted gently. "You opened it. You let us in when nobody else would have. You treated us like human beings when the rest of the world treated us like monsters. And that choice, that single moment of kindness and courage, it changed everything, not just for us, but for you, for this place, for everyone who's been touched by this story. I don't understand what you mean. Bear gestured toward the celebration that filled every corner of the diner and spilled out into the parking lot and beyond. Look around. Frank, look at what you've built here. Not just a successful business, but a community. A place where people from completely different worlds can come together and find common ground. Half these people are here because they heard our story, because they learned about the diner owner who judged people by their hearts instead of their reputations. I just served coffee and made sandwiches. You did so much more than that. And you know it. You created a home for people who didn't have one anywhere else. You made a safe place for outcasts and misfits and people the world had given up on. You treated us with dignity when nobody else would. You showed us that there were still decent people in the world. People who were willing to take risks for strangers. People who understood what hospitality really means. Bear paused, his scarred face serious with the weight of what he was trying to communicate. But it's more than that. Frank, you've changed minds. You've changed hearts. You've changed lives in ways you probably can't even imagine. There are young people out there who chose to join legitimate motorcycle clubs instead of street gangs because they heard about honor and loyalty and brotherhood from men who learned those values at your counter. There are families who didn't cross the street when they saw bikers coming because someone told them about Frank's place, about how appearances can deceive and how kindness can build bridges between the most unlikely people. Frank wiped his eyes with his apron, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Bear was describing. I never intended any of that. I just wanted to help some people get out of a storm. That's exactly why it worked. Bear replied with a smile that was equal parts wisdom and affection. You didn't do it for publicity or profit or to make yourself look good. You did it because it was the right thing to do, because you saw people in need and you had the power to help them. That kind of genuine kindness is rarer than gold, Frank. And when people encounter it, especially people who aren't used to being treated with respect and dignity, it changes them. It makes them want to pass that kindness along to others. As the celebration continued late into the night, Frank reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him from that scared 19-year-old drafted into a war he didn't understand, through the bitter years of readjustment and struggle, to this moment of triumph and community and genuine human connection. He thought about all the choices he had made along the way, both good and bad, and how they had led him to this exact place at this exact time. The lesson he had learned that stormy night had become the guiding principle of his life and his business. Everyone deserves a chance to show who they really are. Everyone deserves to be judged by their actions rather than their appearance. Everyone deserves kindness and respect, and the benefit of the doubt, especially those who seem least likely to deserve it. Today, more than 15 years after that storm changed everything, Frank's place still sits at that crossroads 40 miles outside of Tucson, Arizona. Frank is in his late 70s now, moving a little slower, but still serving the best coffee between Phoenix and El Paso, still maintaining the standards of cleanliness and quality that have made his diner a legend among travelers. The walls are covered with photographs of the thousands of people who have found friendship and acceptance at his counter over the years. Bikers and truckers and families and celebrities and politicians and ordinary folks just passing through on their way to somewhere else. The Mongols still visit regularly, though many of the original faces have changed as members have aged or moved on to other chapters or other lives. Bear is in his 60s now, his beard completely gray and his movements a little stiffer, but his loyalty to Frank is as strong as ever, and his commitment to the brotherhood remains absolute. Rabbit is no longer young, having become a respected leader within the club and a mentor to newer members, but he still stops by whenever he's in the area, still orders apple pie, and still talks about his grandmother and the importance of treating people with respect. And sometimes, late at night, when storm clouds gather over the Arizona desert and the wind begins to howl through the mountains, Frank stands at his window and remembers that moment when everything changed. The moment he chose kindness over fear, compassion over suspicion, humanity over prejudice. The moment he decided to trust his better angels instead of his worst impulses. It was the best choice he ever made, and its consequences continue to ripple outward into the world, touching lives and changing hearts, and proving that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the most profound and lasting impact. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not motorcycles, or corporate greed, or bureaucratic harassment, but the simple truth that human decency still matters in a world that often seems to have forgotten its value. It's about the power of treating people as individuals rather than stereotypes, of judging them by their character rather than their appearance, of offering shelter to strangers even when you don't know what kind of people they might be. It's about understanding that loyalty and friendship can grow in the most unlikely soil, that brotherhood can transcend every boundary of class,